This presentation is delivered by the Stanford Center for Professional Development.
Good evening to everyone. If I could get your attention, we'd like to go ahead and get started. So I'm Jim Plummer, the Dean of the Engineering School. Let me begin by welcoming all of you here. We're just delighted to have a great crowd here in Video Auditorium, and there are hundreds more Stanford alums and friends who are watching the event this evening because it's being webcast throughout the world. We're here, of course, to honor Craig Barrett, who I will introduce in just a moment, who is being inducted as one of our Stanford Engineering Heroes. And I wanted to say just a little bit about the Stanford Engineering Heroes program. This is a program that we started a couple years ago, actually, and it's intended to recognize the achievements of Stanford engineers who have profoundly advanced the course of human, social, and economic progress through engineering. There are 16 people so far that we have named Engineering Heroes, and we plan on naming additional heroes each year going forward. In fact, the next class, I think, will be announced in another month or so. But in being named an Engineering Hero tonight, Craig joins a really quite distinguished group of people. It includes Fred Terman, Bill Hewlett, David Packard, Vint Cerf, GPS creator Brad Parkinson, and Sun Microsystems co-founder Andy Bechtolsheim, among others. There's a wall just out back and down to the right that has plaques listed for all of the engineering heroes. So unlike many events like this, all we really ask of people who we wish to honor in this way is that they tell us how they would like to spend a day or part of a day at Stanford. And we try and set something up that is exciting for them and interesting for all of us as well. And so Craig suggested that he'd like to spend some time with some students. And not surprisingly, he picked students from our material science department, which is where Craig came from. So we had just a wonderful time for the last hour or two talking with some graduate students from material science and engineering and hearing a bit about what they're up to. Craig also suggested he'd like to share some thoughts this evening about research universities, technology, innovation, and 21st century competitiveness. And this is a set of topics I think that all of us care a lot about, and Craig has thought deeply about all of these topics, and so I think we're really looking forward to his comments on these topics, and he's promised that he will leave time at the end for questions, debate, challenges, however you want to put it, because some of these topics are clearly somewhat controversial. So Craig, as all of you know, is best known for his career at Intel, although that's only one of many things that he's done. He spent 35 years at the company and held positions vice president, senior vice president, executive vice president, and later became president and CEO and then chairman of the board in 2005. And Craig is really credited with transforming Intel into the manufacturing powerhouse that it is today. And I think Intel is widely regarded as the premier manufacturing company, certainly in the semiconductor field, but arguably in a much broader set of fields as well. And a lot of this has to do with the manufacturing discipline that Craig instilled in Intel manufacturing plants, a philosophy called copy exactly, which means if it works, do it again the same way. And so he's been recognized in many, many different ways for the contributions he made to the company. The National Academy of Engineering, he has received several honorary doctorates in addition to his real doctorate that he got here at Stanford. Right? Right. And I actually learned this by, if you Google people, you can learn interesting things. And so I did that. This afternoon I learned by Googling you, Craig, that you actually have the equivalent of a knighthood in Malaysia. So I'm not sure what that says about how we have to refer to you, but whatever you tell us we'll do, obviously. So Craig retired from Intel in 2009. He's also really well and widely known for his tireless advocacy for improving education in this country. And there's been a real focus on K12 education. I think Craig will share some thoughts about that in his remarks in just a minute. But he's been a real national spokesperson and advocate for the value that technology can provide to education and trying to set up a value system that improves our K12 education. And I think all of us care a lot about that, and we'll be very interested to hear Craig's comments. He's had holds or has held many positions associated with his interest in education. Until 2009, he was chairman of the United Nations Global Alliance for Information and Communications Technologies Development, which was focused on bringing computers and other technology to developing parts of the world. And he currently is involved, and I could spend the whole evening talking about the things he's involved in here, but just mention a couple. He serves on the Council for Foreign Relations Task Force on U.S. education reform. He chairs the Change the Equation organization, which is a national education, science, technology, engineering, and math coalition. He chairs Achieve, which is a national nonpartisan educational reform organization led by a board of governors and business leaders. And finally, he chairs the Arizona Governor's Arizona Ready Education Council. So you can see he's spending a lot of time thinking and working on educational issues. He's also been very deeply involved with charter schools in Arizona and other parts of the country, and he's thought really deeply about how to improve the K12 education system in this country. Now, of course, those of us here at Stanford also know there's a third part of Craig's career that we're incredibly proud of, in addition to the other two, and that's the time that he spent here as a student and later as a faculty member at Stanford. So he earned bachelor's, master's, and his real doctorate in material science and engineering here at Stanford. And he served actually on the faculty here of our material science department for 10 years until he was lured away by Intel, where he had the career I just described a minute ago. Now, even in the time he was here at Stanford teaching, he had a research group and students, and he published a bunch of papers, wrote a quite famous textbook, I think was co-authored with Bill Nix, who's also here tonight. Welcome, Bill. And so tonight, really these three aspects of Craig's life, the time he spent here at Stanford and as a student and as a faculty member, the time he spent doing just amazing things at one of the great companies in this country, and then finally his passion and contributions to education in this nation, I think are all of the reasons why we honor him tonight as an engineering hero. Craig? So I will put this in a bag so you can carry it, but this is a replica of the plaque that sits on the wall just outside around the corner, which you can put on your desk.
It's made out of silicon, right?
It's made out of silicon, right. That's good, good. Anyway,
Thank you, Jim. Thank you. Well, good evening, everyone. It's such a pleasure to be back at Stanford, although I have to say Stanford didn't quite look like this when I was here. Dean Plummer has had quite a building spree going on, and this engineering quad is quite fantastic. And it's especially nice to see some of the old material science people that I used to kick around with over the years. Unfortunately, they look about as old as I look. I arrived on this campus in 1957. I grew up at a small town to the north of here, San Carlos. Went to Carmel High School there and migrated my way 6.7 miles south to campus. When I arrived here in 1957, the university looked a little different. There were still trolley tracks up from downtown Palo Alto to the main quad. You did not have to have a parking sticker. There were no parking lots or parking structures. You could park anywhere you could find a parking place. And perhaps the most significant difference was tuition was $250 a quarter. Having sent one of my grandkids through here recently, I can attest that the tuition has gone up to some degree. But the university has changed, obviously, a heck of a lot since 1957. And correspondingly, the rest of the world has also changed quite a lot. And I wanted to really talk a little bit about those changes tonight, and maybe even give you some ideas about things the United States could do. And I know there are a lot of foreign nationals in the audience, and so I won't dwell so much on the U.S., although being a U.S. citizen, I'm very concerned about the future of the United States. But a lot of things I say I think will carry significance to other countries as well as the United States. I wanted to start out with just a very simple observation. I spent 35 years in the high-tech business. And there's one rule in the high-tech business, and that is that market shares are won and lost during periods of transition. Technology transition, market transition, any sort of transition you can think about. Those are the times when market shares are won and lost. And if you want to put that in current perspective, you could think back 25 years ago, Motorola was the key communication company in the world, especially in handsets. They lost that to a Finnish company called Nokia when there was a transition from analog to digital handsets. Nokia has succeeded in losing their predominant position with the advent of the smartphone recently. So you can see huge market share shifts when a technology transition comes about. It's usually pretty hard to win market share away when it's a static market. And you just attack the other person and try to offer something a little cheaper, a little bit better, but there's no big transition occurring. The reason I bring that topic up is if you look at the world in the last 20 years, I think you've seen the biggest transition that the free world economic system has ever seen. And that started with the ending of the Cold War between the US and Russia, which opened up Russia and Eastern Europe to the world's free economic system. About the same time, India moved away from an isolationist, socialistic approach, joined the free economic system. About the same time, China did exactly the same thing. Several South American countries did the same thing. Several other Southeast Asian countries did the same thing. The net result of all that is the world's free economic system, which had been a very controlled place, Western Europe, Japan, and the US, three roughly equivalent geographic areas, population, standard of living, all of a sudden had an influx of 3 billion new capitalists in the world's economic system. And if you want a transition, that's a transition. Half of the world's population almost overnight jumps from isolationist, socialist approach to a free market capitalist approach. The reason I dwell on that for a moment is, in fact, we're undergoing that transition still today, and it's likely that market shares, substantial world economic market shares, will be won and lost as this transition continues to play out. And the United States, being the strongest economic power going into that transition, probably has a much higher probability of losing market share than gaining market share. And we'll come back to that in a moment. So that's one general observation. Another general observation is one that the reason you're all here at Stanford is your standard of living, the standard of living of any population, any society, depends on how much value add you can put into what you do in your professional life. And so your salary, your standard of living depends on your education, which determines if you can add value to what you do. So education is incredibly important. Third general observation is, I think, pretty obvious with the advent of the internet and the opening of the world to a free market capitalist system, that information and money flows very freely. You all know that. You can go to the internet and find out anything. You know, there are some IP restrictions on how information flows, but pretty much information flows freely across borders, and money is very liquid and flows to the point of highest return. And so investments today are made on a worldwide basis, not on a local basis. And if you have a good environment for investments, you can attract investments. If you don't have a good environment, you lose out on those investments. And I'll make some mentions relative to the US on investment strategy and environment in a few moments. And you all know, because you're techies, that this is a century of innovation and technology, and it's minds and not brawn that are going to succeed. But those are the general rules. The biggest two rules are really education, super important, and market shares are won and lost in periods of transition. We're in the biggest transition you've ever seen. Now, if you believe that societies or cultures or countries can do something about their economic future, And I've had the ability to travel to about 130 or 140 different countries and talk to leaders, government leaders, academic leaders, business leaders in those countries. And you ask them, what are they doing? It turns out it always boils down to the same three things. Countries have three levers they can pull to try to influence their economic future. And the first lever is, not surprisingly, education. How well do you educate your populace, your workforce? How much value add can they do? And a well-educated individual is just a super, super powerful thing. And I just wanted to give you, I'll try to interject a few examples from my past at Intel as we go through here. In the mid-'70s, shortly after I joined the company, and the main product that we had was something called a 4K dynamic RAM. Most of you young people have never seen a 4K dynamic RAM. That was a magnificent upgrade from the 1103, which was a 1K dynamic RAM. But we were making 4K dynamic RAMs, and we were shipping them to Western Electric to put in PBXs. And so what they would do is they would program the PBX with all the phone numbers and extensions and things like that. And there was a great improvement over old magnetic core memory and the previous solutions. But there was one minor problem. These 4K dynamic RAMs occasionally would drop a bit. And that did not make Western Electric happy. Western Electric, by the way, was the manufacturing arm of Bell Telephone, the big monopoly at that time. So I was running reliability engineering at Intel at the time, and I had a frequent flyer plane ticket from Silicon Valley to Denver, where Western Electric was making these PBXs. And we had the best minds in Western Electric, and they had a lot of great minds there. And at Intel, trying to figure out why these 4K DRAMs occasionally dropped a bit. And it was a soft drop. You know, a dynamic RAM bit, for those of you who are not into those circuits, is basically a little capacitor. And it's a 1 if you have some electrons in, it's a 0 if you don't. So dropping a bit basically meant you either lost some electrons or gained some electrons in that capacitor. Problem was solved by a well-educated, super smart individual when the total technical forces of Intel and Western Electric were unable to solve the problem. And the solution went something like this. This young man, his name is Tim May, had heard Gordon Moore give a speech. Gordon Moore was talking about Moore's Law, and so we were now in the mid-'70s. Gordon Moore postulated Moore's Law in the mid-'60s, so you'd had 10 years of shrinking dimensions and so forth. And Gordon said, effectively, hey, you know, if we keep this up for a long, long time, the dimensions will get so small that there's a possibility that circuits could be corrupted or altered by some things like cosmic rays coming in from the universe and hitting the circuit and making something happen. And Tim had taken that to heart, and he started thinking about that. And then he started thinking, okay, these dynamic RAMs are put in ceramic packages. Ceramics are basic aluminum oxide, but they might have small amounts of impurities. Some of those impurities might be radioactive. They might be emitting things like alpha particles. And if one of those alpha particles were to hit the surface of the die and create electron hole pairs, and those electrons are collected in one of these little capacitors of this, one of the bits of the dynamic RAM, they could shift its state. And he was just thinking like this by himself. He wasn't chartered to work on this problem. He wasn't, no one was depending on him to solve the problem. So late one night, he got a whole bunch of ceramic piece parts, packages these things are made out of, put them in essentially a Geiger counter, let it count all night with the parts in it, let it count all next night without the parts in it, determined there was a slight radioactive content to these parts. And then the conclusive experiment he demonstrated was, in fact, there was a small amount of thorium in the aluminum oxide, which was radioactive, was decaying, giving off alpha particles. The way he demonstrated this absolutely was to go to the ultimate alpha particle source, which you all know is a smoke detector. Smoke detectors work by sending out alpha particles, ionize smoke particles, collect them, so forth. Really ought to study smoke detectors. But Tim knocked the cap off of some of these 4K DRAMs, which were in a memory board, brought the alpha particle source right to the top of the package, and was able, depending on how close he got, get a 10 or 12 order of magnitude increase in the soft error rate, the higher the alpha particle density on the surface. Now, if you know a little bit about alpha particles, they don't penetrate very far, but the active surface of a silicon circuit is not very far below the passivation layer. Put a piece of Scotch tape on it, that absorbs all the alpha particles, so you could solve the problem pretty easily. But it was one smart guy thinking out of the box with a good education that was able to outdo a whole team of Western Electric and Intel researchers who were working on this problem for weeks. Education is so important. Smart guys and gals are so important. So that's the first lever people have, is education. That's how you justify a high standard of living. You add value to what you do. The second societal strategy is investing in ideas. And that's R&D. And we could go on all night with great R&D that goes on here at Stanford, not only in the engineering school, but in the university as a whole, or the collection of research universities in the United States. But just think of the industry I've been in and the folks back at Bell Labs, Bourdin, Herring, Shockley, creation of the transistor back in the 50s, Jack Kilby, Bob Noyce at Fairchild and TI separately, research, figuring out the integrated circuit, Ted Hoff, Federico Virgin, Stan Mazer, creating the first 4-bit microprocessors at Intel. Investment in research creates the next generation of products, the next generation of businesses, the next generation of services. There's a great correlation around the world for economies, the percentage of the GDP that goes into research and the growth of those economies. They're creating the seed corn, the ideas of the future. So you have two levers so far. One is you need smart people. Next one is you need to invest in new ideas. Smart people, smart ideas. And the only third lever that exists for any economy, any society, is to allow smart people to get together with smart ideas and do something wonderful. You have just a great example right here. Silicon Valley, Stanford, UC Berkeley. It hurts me to say UC Berkeley, but but they've been a critical part of Silicon Valley. The two great universities, research universities, spinning off smart people and smart ideas, a venture capital community, a society that does not frown on failure. It's not a cultural norm around the world to like failure, but Silicon Valley loves failure, gives you experience. That's the right environment to do something wonderful. By the way, California is struggling today on continuing to be the right environment for smart people to get together with smart ideas in terms of its tax structure, its regulatory structure, its deficit structure, its disinvestment in education. It's struggling to keep that, but certainly Silicon Valley, Route 128 outside of MIT and Harvard is another area. Austin, Texas is another area. Some of the Midwest research universities are wonderful areas, the right environment to do right things. Those are the only three things you have if you're in charge of a government or in charge of an economy to stimulate that economy's growth. Smart people, smart ideas, and then the right environment to let those two get together and do something. Now, what are people around the world doing today? You know, Silicon Valley has been recognized by everybody. The Russians are trying to copy Silicon Valley right now, a place called Skolkovo. Cut a deal with MIT, create an MIT-like research university, try to build on the Russian heritage of academics and research, but no commercialization, but trying to build on what MIT has done to bring industry close to the university, much like Dean Plummer has done at Stanford, to bring local industry close to the School of Engineering. No matter where you go in the world, just about every country is trying to copy Stanford or MIT or Caltech, the premier US research university. Every European country is trying to move their universities more towards the Western, the US model. Not have it as an ivory tower, but have it work closely with industry. Back and forth exchange of people and ideas. Work on real problems. Not only are people trying to copy US universities, but US universities have a thriving business projecting themselves to the rest of the world. You cannot go to a Chinese university and not find half a dozen Western universities there exchanging faculty, curricula, research projects. From an industrial perspective, I've always found it very interesting. I think US research universities are the national treasure. There are no restrictions on them transferring, you guys transferring your capability outward. If you work at a technology company, there's all sorts of restrictions on transferring your technology. It's an interesting dichotomy. But the rest of the world has recognized the power of the research university. When I've talked to groups, I like to give a simple example of how powerful research universities are and the power of a single idea. Most of you in the audience have heard of Microsoft. Pretty big company, pretty big research budget. Probably their research budget today is $8 to $9 billion a year. Microsoft has been seriously challenged 3 or 4 times in its career. None of those challenges have come from other companies with equally large research budgets. The challenges have not come from IBM. They have not come from SAP or Oracle or HP or Intel or anybody of that sort. If you just look at Microsoft's history, where have the corporate challenges been? The internet browser came from superconducting laboratory at the University of Illinois. The internet directory, where'd it come from, Jim? Stanford University. The internet search engine, where'd it come from? Google, Stanford University. Each one of those projects was not a big research project. 1 or 2 researchers with a bright idea. Ladies and gentlemen, that is the power of the individual idea. It can take down the largest corporation. That's why research universities are so powerful. They cultivate smart people to be creative and come out with brilliant ideas. The rest of the world is trying to copy that. And yet there are other techniques as well. The country of Chile has a couple of universities, not very highly ranked in the world. I think the highest ranked university in Chile is ranked number 350 or so. But someone in the government there said, you know, if we could make Chile entrepreneurial, we might be able to stimulate our economy and really short-circuit this university stuff. So Chile goes out and starts to give $50,000 grants to entrepreneurs who want to go to Santiago and create a business. And it's amazing how far you can spread $10 million in $50,000 grants. And they're bringing every 6 months 100 or 200 new ideas, entrepreneurial startups into Santiago. Most of them are software and social software type startups. But smart people with smart ideas jump-starting the economy. As I mentioned, the Russians are trying to do this. The Irish are trying to do this. The Chinese are trying to do this. Everyone has recognized there are 3 levers. You pull those 3 levers, you can get results. The one thing that I think is clear, traveling the world and looking at what's happening, is what doesn't work. Protecting your economy with tariffs doesn't work. Not working hard doesn't work. Not committing to serious educational attainment doesn't work. It's hard work, but everybody else in the world is trying to do this. So what about the USA today? Richest country in the world? Has been for 50 years. Beneficiary of World War II when every other economy was destroyed. Beneficiary of an immigration policy which allowed the best and brightest from the world to come to the US. Beneficiary of the best university system in the world. but having problems. The National Academies, about 7 years ago, did a study of the U.S. economy and the future of the U.S. economy. It was called Rising Above the Gathering Storm. So National Academy of Science, National Academy of Engineering, Institute of Medicine looked at the problems the U.S. was having. Educational infrastructure problems, the decrease in the relative percentage of GDP going into R&D, tax structure, which was not incentivizing investment in the U.S., but was incentivizing investment out of the United States. An immigration policy that defies explanation or imagination. You know, I had dinner tonight with a bunch of students from the material science department. At least half of them are foreign nationals. The U.S. has an immigration policy that says, let's educate the best and brightest in the world at U.S. taxpayer expense and send them home. You cannot find a single person in Washington, D.C. who will not agree with you when you say that's a dumb idea and a dumb strategy. You cannot find a single person. But when you get two of them or more in a room, they refuse to do anything about it. And still refuse to do anything about it. I can remember about 15 to 20 years ago at Intel, we were lobbying for immigration reform and came up with the idea of stapling a green card to an advanced degree from a U.S. university. That has at least now made it, after 15 to 20 years, to the Staple Act, which has never made it out of committee yet in the House. But a very, very simple solution to a complex, seemingly complex problem. There are a couple of other interesting observations you can make. As Jim mentioned, I've served on a Council on Foreign Relations study. Many of you probably aren't familiar with the Council on Foreign Relations. They're really interested in national security issues, primarily. So you ask, what is the organization that worries about national security, worrying about education for? And they worry about it for two reasons. One, which is an extremely sobering statistic, and one which is more of a philosophical issue. The philosophic issue is national security is increasingly not military security, it's economic security. You can't have economic security unless you have a good education system. So the decline of the K12 education system in the U.S. leads the Council on Foreign Relations to worry about K12 education reform. The practical statistic that they note is if you take a random selection of 18 to 24-year-olds in the United States, 75% or more of them are ineligible for service in the military. For one of three reasons. They are physically unfit, can't pass the physical exam, they're incarcerated, probably don't want them in the military, they can't pass the educational requirements to get into the military. Over 75% of our young people are not eligible for military service. So you had a committee chaired by Condi Rice, great Stanford talent, and Joel Klein, who used to run the New York City school system, conclude exactly the same thing about K-12 education reform that a dozen other studies over the last 50 years have concluded. You need great teachers, you need high expectations, and you need some tension. I'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. You have a couple of other aspects of the U.S. which are a little bit troubling too. One is a comment that Laura Tyson made, and Laura Tyson, I think, still runs the Haas Business School, or is Haas Business School professor over at Berkeley. She was Clinton's economic advisor. When asked if the universities in the U.S. were doing a good job educating people for the future and the jobs of the future, she said, well, yes. And then when asked what the jobs for the future were in the United States, she said, well, the main ones are going to be healthcare and education. And that's, as she said it, it kind of sounded right. Healthcare is growing, and education is growing, employs a lot of people. But then if you start to think about it for a minute, what pays for education and healthcare jobs? Unless you're exporting education, Stanford does a pretty good job at that. It's an income source. Unless you're exporting healthcare, make it an income source, it's a drain on society because tax pays for it. Individuals pay for it. It's not a value creation exercise. Value creation exercises are where you make something or you have a service that people buy from you, not you're self-servicing your population. So I was a little concerned when a presidential economic advisor was not concerned at all that we're not educating people to create value to grow our economy. We're educating people to sustain our economy in healthcare and education. So, where are we today? This guy, David Walker. Anybody heard of David Walker? Okay, you get educated. David was a Comptroller General from 1998 to 2008. Comptroller General of the United States. That's the guy who basically looks at the books of the United States and tries to balance the budget and tells you when you're spending too much. David spent 10 years traveling the United States, and he's still doing it today for the Pete Peterson Foundation, which is kind of picked up on what Walker was saying, that this is a totally unstable situation. You're spending way more than you can afford to spend. You're going into debt. The unfunded liabilities of health care and pensions and all that is way out of whack. You need to do one of a couple things. You either need to stop spending so much or get more revenue. That's kind of what the whole presidential campaign has been about. Stop spending so much or get more revenue. Mr. Walker started that speech about 14 years ago. Unfortunately, nobody has done anything about it in those 14 years, but we'll get to that in a minute. So, we're deep in debt in the U.S., $16 trillion. We're spending $1 trillion more each year than we take in. We slipped in education, and let me give you the one, I think, most damaging education statistics that's apparent. Not a K12 education statistic, but a post-secondary education statistic. The United States used to be number one in the world in the percentage of its workforce with a post-secondary degree. Number one in the world. Where is it today? In the OECD countries, it's somewhere between number 13 and number 14. Over the last 20 or 30 years, we are essentially the only OECD country, economically developed country, where the fraction of our workforce with a post-secondary degree in the basically 55 to 65 category is higher than it is in the 25 to 35 category. We're the only country where there's been a slight decrease in the percentage of our workforce with a post-secondary degree. When you hear the presidential candidates talking about returning the American middle class to high-paying jobs, you have to think seriously about the skill set of that middle class to use their brains to add value to what they do without massive retraining. And as long as you see the United States continuing to slip in the rankings of its workforce with a percentage of post-secondary degrees, you have to worry about the United States economy going forward. How can it justify having the highest standard of living? Middle class the size that it's had. The other thing, obviously, is math and science competency of our young people. I'm sure you've all seen the TV ads that Exxon has been running and other companies have been running, the results of the NAEP tests or the PISA tests, any of the internationally benchmarked tests, which show the U.S. kids who used to rank very high in math and science now rank in essentially the bottom quartile of the OECD countries in those topics, and they're not getting any better. Other countries are improving faster than the slow improvement we're getting. And the last characteristic I'd say that we have today is characterized by California. You have a proposition in front of you to raise taxes next Tuesday. You're going to have the highest personal income tax in the U.S. You're going to drive more of your wealthy people out. When I was at Intel, we told 4 consecutive governors we'd never put another manufacturing plant in this state. They didn't believe us. We didn't. California is a little bit symptomatic of the rest of the United States. If you want to compete, you have to provide an environment where there's some incentive to invest, not disincentives to invest. And a lot of the United States hasn't learned that lesson, and California is probably a particularly strong example of that. So, having laid out this very optimistic position, I would now want to switch roles and be optimistic for a minute. And what I want to do is just take a minute to tell you, if I were running for president, which I am not, but if I were, what I would suggest could be done in a heartbeat to make this situation a lot better, and to build on some of the strengths we have, and also to correct some of the weaknesses that we have. And I'm not going to touch on the issues of Social Security and health care. And Social Security is a trivial fix, and once you get beyond the emotion of Social Security and you say, I'm going to extend the retirement age by a couple of years and make it a means-tested payout, Social Security takes care of itself. It's just getting over the emotion of doing those two things, which are kind of trivial with current life expectancy, and the fact that wealthy people, kind of like myself, I get my Social Security check each month, which I give immediately to charity, but I still get it. I don't need it. So a means testing and a slight extension of the retirement age would take care of Social Security. Healthcare is more difficult. We could talk about healthcare in the question and answer session, but I've got equally simple solutions there. Much simpler than Obamacare, I guarantee you. But I think there are about 5 things you could do almost instantaneously to get the U.S. back on the right track. The first one obviously involves where we are today. Research universities, really the heart and soul of the United States economy, because this is where the new ideas and the smart people come from. This is something we have been proposing for decades, but you could do it overnight. And it is not a big deal from a financial standpoint. It is from the results, but not from the input financial side. I would double or treble the NSF budget, the NIH budget, the DOE research budget, any basic research budget the United States government has, that they farm out to our Tier 1 research universities to conduct that research. I would just double or treble it overnight, and then reap the benefits as time would go on. We've been lobbying that for years. The Rising Above the Gathering Storm reports from the national academies said double it, but I think you could do even more. Any idea what the NSF budget, annual budget is? It is a rounding error, folks. And a rounding error compared to what we spend on other things. And I'll tell you how to pay for it in just a moment. I would have a sensible immigration policy. I would staple a green card, permanent residency card, for any graduate of any of a select number of STEM fields, or anybody who graduates from a U.S. university. I would just staple a green card, and also make it easy for foreign nationals to come with a green card to the U.S. That fixes legal immigration overnight. It doesn't fix the illegal immigration problem, but quite frankly, the legal immigration problem is the critical one from an economic driving force, not illegal immigration. And you could fix that almost overnight. President Obama tried to fix the illegal immigration problem with an executive order. I wish he had an executive order as strong on the legal immigration side. That would allow the best and the brightest to continue to come to the U.S. and ply their trades. How do I pay for doubling or trebling the research budgets? This is where I get into trouble with some of my industrial peers. I would cut every government subsidy to the corporate world to zero. Forget about ethanol. Forget about green energy. Forget about R&D tax credits. Dean Plummer is still on the Intel board, and he should cringe when I say forget about R&D tax credits. But I would cut all government subsidies, and I would return to a capitalist society. Government doesn't pick winners and losers. Government doesn't give subsidies to companies. Companies make it on their own. At the same time, I would lower the corporate tax rate to an internationally competitive level to incentivize corporate investment in the United States. Corporate tax rate in the U.S. is about the highest in the world, 1/10 of a percentage point below Japan. It needs to go from its 35% to 40%, depending if you add state and federal taxes together. It needs to go from that to the 15% range to incentivize investments in the United States to create jobs. But cutting subsidies, I think, would more than pay for the cut in tax rate and would more than pay the increase in R&D. Item 4, my platform. K12 education. The United States has gone from the envy of the world, educating our young people, to a mediocre state today. And it's been mediocre for quite some time. A gentleman by the name of James Harvey in 1983 authored something called A Nation at Risk. 1983, a long time ago. Nation at Risk built on a previous publication published in 1958 called Pursuit of Excellence. But Mr. Harvey said in 1983, if a foreign nation had imposed upon the United States the mediocrity of our current education system, we would consider it an act of war. It's a very strong statement. 1983, 30 years ago. And that built on a study which was done in 58. And every study since then has said exactly the same thing that those studies have said, which is you need systemic fix at K-12 education. And the systemic fix is like every other country that has a good education system. High qualified, motivated, professionally compensated teachers, high expectations, and some tension in the system. And you ask what tension is. Tension is competition, it's pay for performance, it's closing down failing schools, it's choice. So my 4th platform item involves buying a whole bunch of backpacks. I want to give every 5-year-old in the United States a backpack. And you ask why? Because every fall, I want that child to go to the state and get their backpack filled up with the $10,000 or so a year that the state spends on education, give it to that child and their family, and then let the family spend that money to get that child educated wherever they want. If they want to go to a public school, the kid takes their backpack to a public school, gives them the money. They want to go to a charter school, private school, a parochial school, I don't care what it is. We've talked for 55 years about reforming K-12 education. And the only real reform we have is that 40 states have some form of competition, limited competition mostly, in terms of charter schools. We need more competition, more choice, if you want the current system to change. So every kid gets a backpack and the money follows the kid. The kid doesn't go to the school where the money goes. The adults in this system have proven themselves incapable of doing a good job. Let the parents and the kid decide where to go to get educated. I do not make many friends in the teachers' unions. But that is precisely the problem. It's not the teachers that's the problem, and it's not just the teachers' union. It's the established bureaucracy that we have put in place that preserves the status quo. You know, there are a couple of great quotes here that you've probably heard about K-12 education. One was from a president of the teachers' union, which basically said, when the kids start paying union dues, then we'll worry about them. And the other quote is obviously, the system is built for the adults, it's not built for the children. Choice, vouchers, whatever you want to call it, I think is absolutely key here. We have some great public schools. You know, my kids went to Gunn High School, still a great high school. Any kid that goes to that high school gets a great education. That is an outlier in the United States, what happens at Henry Gunn High School. It is not typical. I would have no hesitation sending a child to Gunn High School. However, most of the other high schools in the United States would not be worthy of my child to go to. Okay, item 5. You may suspect that I have Republican leanings. I'm now going to differ with the Republican Party. I want to freeze the defense budget until further notice. In fact, if I could have a job in the future, my job would be as Secretary of Defense with no salary, but getting 10% of all the savings I could achieve as Secretary of Defense. That's not the only condition. The other condition is I would not have a board of directors of 535 people. That is the House and the Senate. Can you imagine running a business where every decision you make is second-guessed and overruled by anybody who has their district to have something to do with that decision you're making? And that's exactly what we have today. Just to put it in perspective, the United States spends about $750 billion a year on defense. If you rank that relative to the other countries in the world, we spend more than the next 17 combined. That's probably enough. I'm just going to freeze it. I'm not going to cut it. I just freeze it at 750 and then let's get on with our life. And it's going to pay for some of these other programs. Most of all, the reason I kind of lay those 4 or 5 items out are, you have to make up your mind that you're going to compete in the 21st century. It's a huge transition. It is the biggest economic transition the world has ever seen. Half of the world's population, overnight, changing sides. 3 billion new capitalists. You either choose to compete, you lose market share. And the current state is that the U.S. hasn't made up its mind to compete. It's blaming China for this. It's blaming somebody for that. Blaming the other party for this, when in fact it's the fundamentals that have to be fixed. So why am I really excited? I think the 21st century has got such great opportunity because of places like Stanford. I mean, the marriage of biology and engineering is just starting, just getting off the map. The whole biotech revolution is just beginning. Something very close to my heart, the marriage of electronics and photonics is just starting. Some of the work that happens to be taking place at Intel, silicon lasers, detectors, the ability on a single integrated silicon chip to put photonic devices and electronic devices. Means Moore's law just gets to go bananas for the next couple of decades. Some basic technology that originated here, X-ray free electron laser, demonstrated at Stanford, Lawrence Berkeley lab up across the bay, wants to build a great next generation light source, hugely more powerful X-ray laser. And just, I mean, if you want to start to think about studying molecular reactions or atomic reactions, Just think about it, basically a pulsed coherent X-ray laser where you can effectively image atoms or molecules in chemical reactions, like a strobe light bouncing around 100 million frames a second. I mean, these things are exciting. I mean, they're incredibly exciting, incredibly opportunity going forward. I think this university, and Jim and I were talking about this earlier today, is in the midst of a great transition. I brought up earlier, when I came here, tuition was $250 a quarter, $750 a year. It was astronomically expensive at the time, but not as expensive as it is today. And at the current rate, what happens to Stanford in 20 years? Especially with the onslaught of online education. When you can educate hundreds of thousands of students online rather than 1,000 students in the classroom. What is the future of the university? Talk about a transition. Who's going to be the winner or loser in that transition? And what happens? That's exciting. That's opportunity. And if Stanford makes the right choices, then they blossom and they gain market share going forward. They make the wrong choice, they're like Motorola and the cell phone. They make the right choice. You know, in textbooks, I have two grandkids, both getting MBAs, one in Anderson School at UCLA and one at Northwestern. And I bankroll their tuition and their books and such. And I get the bill each quarter for their books. You know, it was mentioned earlier that Bill Nix and I co-authored a textbook. And Bill, what did it sell for when it started? $15. $15. The book fee for my two grandkids for each quarter is somewhere between $1,000 and $1,500. $200 a book. I think that's unstable, and obviously that's a transition in process of happening. Going from hard copy, limited edition to online. These are the exciting things going on in the future. These are the things that would be fun to be involved with. But back to the United States, I love to go to Chinese food restaurants for one very simple reason. The wisdom in the Chinese fortune cookie is unbeatable. It's never wrong. It's always right. I want to give you two fortune cookies tonight. One is what we've been talking about in terms of education. This comes, how many of you have been to Chef Chu's down in El Camino? My favorite place. Great fortune cookie, 10 or 15 years ago. The world will always accept talent with open arms. What is talent? Talent is education and passion for what you do. No matter what you do, want to be a poet, a physician, physicist, whatever. If you have talent, great education and passion, the world will always accept you with open arms. It's not just the education, but it's the education and the passion. That's the talent. Second fortune cookie, Golden Phoenix, 16th Street, Phoenix, Arizona, is where I live these days. You cannot win unless you choose to compete. My contention is, in the transition we're seeing in the world's economic system, your economy cannot win unless you choose to compete. And the way you compete is to go back with the three levers that I mentioned. Education, investment in ideas for the future, and then create the right environment to let smart people get together with smart ideas and do something. I had hopes in the presidential campaign this year the topics that the presidential candidates would talk about were the ones I listed tonight. I've been somewhat disappointed. We have talked about whether the capital of Israel should be Jerusalem or Tel Aviv. We've talked about how many times God should be in the Democratic platform. We've talked about all of these topics, but we haven't really talked about the key ones. I hope the U.S., under its new president, or extension of the current president, whoever gets elected next Tuesday, will choose to compete. Thank you for your time. I'll try to answer any questions you might have. Yes?
What's your solution for the healthcare?
It's really a pretty simple model. It's back to the old HMO model. What I would do is think of Walmart or Costco or any of these Kmart, those guys, which are integrated retailers. I want an integrated healthcare solution where, in fact, the integrated healthcare provider has all of the stuff that you need. And think of them like competing superstores in the corner. You're able to go from one to the other and your records follow you, but for one single fee, they pay for your entire healthcare coverage, and then they compete on the basis of performance, service, etc. But you have to have 3 or 4 of them so you have choices and there's competition, as opposed to the fractured fee-for-service system we have today. I don't think fee-for-service you'll ever be able to modify it and make it effective. There's attempts to integrate, virtually integrate the different parts of it. But I think you take Kaiser Permanente or Intermountain Health or any one of these guys, which is an integrated healthcare delivery deal. Mayo Clinic is another good example. But you need those on a large scale, which compete on the basis of quality and customer service and price. We're a long way from that, and that's not really what Obamacare is all about. Obamacare doesn't really give you a systemic change. All that it says is the government will slash the amount it pays for something or redirect you or deny you service. This is a totally capitalistic approach and let various people compete, and then the consumer gets to go to whoever does the best job, in a nutshell. Yeah?
What do you think the low-hanging fruit is in applying technology to K12 education?
I have said for years that in response to the question of if you had your choice of one piece of technology to put in the classroom to dramatically improve education, what would it be? And my answer hasn't changed. It's a good teacher. A good teacher trumps all technology. In fact, if you look at the United States as an example and you said that you can solve the problem with technology, the U.S. has essentially way more technology in the classrooms than essentially any other country. We ought to be winning on the basis of our technology investment. It's not technology, it's good teachers and high expectations. Yes?
It's an observation on K12 education, and I'd like to see if you agree with it, and if you do, how it fits in the way you see things. And that is that K12 education is normally measured by its output, but it has inputs and outputs. And especially in California, the inputs are troubled, dysfunctional families, all sorts of other problems, people that don't speak English coming in. And in fact, you can predict outputs based on the parents more than you can based on the schools. So if you look at K12 as inputs and outputs, how do you measure how well California is doing or the US, and does that change your point of view about how bad our schools are?
Well, the question is about inputs and outputs in education, and there are a bunch of input variables. Input variables are not only the nature of the family as a kind of an environmental input, but there's how many teachers you have per kids or kids per teachers, how big the classroom is, how much you pay your teachers, how many days you go to school. There are all sorts of input variables. One of the primary problems of K12 education is it's been an input-driven system with total ignoring the output. And the output is how much a kid learns. And if you run any company and you go to Wall Street, nobody gives a damn about the input variables. They only care about the output. And K through 12 is exactly turned on its head in that respect. It's all input-driven, not output-driven. Your specific question about the socioeconomic background of the parents and the parental support, there's been a lot of discussion about that, but there are a lot of great examples in the poorest socioeconomic environments where schools have said, I know that everybody has a concern about this, but let's ignore that. We get the kids 8 hours a day, 5 days a week, which is more than their parents have them. And let's see what a job we can do educating them, basically ignoring that family background. And they get some fantastic results. The problem is that there's always something that gets in the way of the output. Conveniently gets in the way of the output. And it's only when you say, no, the output's the only important thing, that you get results. And to get results, you always need kind of the same three things. You need great teachers who know their subject material. You need high expectations. Hey, everybody in this room was a kid, right? Some of you may still be, but everybody in the room was a kid. When somebody told you to do something as a kid, they said, jump this high. How high did you jump? Just to get over that barrier. And when I said, jump this high, how high did you jump? Kids are so flexible, and adults, the system does not give them the credit they deserve for how flexible and what they can attain. And the tension you need in the system, you need good teachers, you need high expectations, and the tension is why I want to buy every kid a backpack. The only way the system will change is competition. I'll give you a very simple example. I'm chairman of a charter school system based in Arizona. We just opened our first school in Washington, D.C., not known for its high academic achievement. Washington, D.C., not our school system. Our school system is pretty high level. Just to give you an example, typical kid finishes their junior year in high school, they've taken and passed 10 to 12 AP courses by their junior year. So pretty high academic achievement. We announced we're going to Washington, D.C. We announced the location of our school. The 3 surrounding high schools to our location immediately announced honors programs, which they did not have before, to try to satisfy the kids in those schools who want honors programs or advanced academic stuff, just on the announcement that we're coming. That's what competition buys you. It wouldn't have happened unless that announcement had happened, that we were coming to D.C. So now that we've got socioeconomic stuff, all the hands are going up.
Just wondering why, like, northern countries like Sweden, Finland, and Norway succeeding without this back.
You know, the Nordic countries have historically been very high in the education spectrum. Finland especially, although it's now got some pretty good competition with some of the city-states in China, Shanghai, and those areas. Finland education system kind of satisfies the 3 things that I mentioned. It's more difficult to get into a teaching school or get accepted in the teaching profession in Finland than it is to get into Stanford's engineering school. Teaching is held in very high esteem in Finland. You get and track the best and brightest, so you get very good teachers. Secondly, they measure themselves on an international basis. Whatever PISA, TIMSS, you name the international test, that's how they grade themselves. And they do a very good job proactively with tension in the system by trying to help struggling students or teachers or administrators. They kind of satisfy the 3 basic requirements. The United States, in contrast, every study has shown that a school of education in the United States typically attracts the bottom 25% of college entrants. You skew the School of Education, you skew the teacher population to the downside, where the Nordic countries skew it to the upside. And then you get the net result of that out. Korea, similar type of deal. China, similar type of deal. Yes, way in the back?
I'd like to bring the conversation back to technology investment. And Silicon Valley venture capitalists, really made this place what it is today. And right now, at least for the last several years, they've been heavily investing in social media, Web 2.0 companies. What do you think it's going to take to get the venture capital community back focused on investing in real high-tech entrepreneurship, semiconductor, heavy manufacturing, et cetera?
Well, my opinion is the venture capital community made a bet about 10 or 12 years ago on infrastructure type investments. They were all green, and they were enamored with making green investments. I think they made a fundamental mistake when they made those investments, because practically every one of those investments required something called a subsidy from the US government to be successful. But a lot of those investments were heavy-duty investments. I mean, the Solyndra type things and that sort of stuff. Bright Source. These are huge infrastructure investments. A lot of VC money went into those. I think the mistake was made to depend on the subsidy from the government as a viable business model. I think that's kind of burned the venture capital community for a period of time. Social media is a very low infrastructure investment. And so you're looking for some fast returns to replace those returns. I wish that those guys had not made those green investments, that they had continued to make capitalist investments without any government subsidy attached. Way in the back.
Let's just say you're master of the tech universe and you could assemble a consortium of companies to compete with Apple. Who would you want to try to assemble together, and what would you think about the strategy to make it work? What to make it play?
Well, Intel would be high on my list. I think that Apple under Steve Jobs, Steve was a master at human interface and reading what to put in the market at the right time. And you go back to the iPod. The iPod was about the 30th MP3 player that came out. It just had a bit better form factor. It had Steve's association with Hollywood and the music companies. He was able to package iTunes in a nice device, which nobody else did. So it was what the customer wanted. And the guy with the computer next to you, which has an Intel chip in it, it's a nice user interface and a pretty good operating system and so forth. iPhone and iPad or similar type devices. If I was going to assemble a team, I'd sure like a good human interface team. Maybe I'd go over to the D school here, Jim, and get some of your bright folks out of there. I'd certainly want some severe electronic technology inside for the fastest processors and memory devices and solid-state drives, and some good display technology. And then I'd work like heck to get the apps community behind me, because the major part of the human interface is going to be all the apps that go with it, as he's showing us now as he turns the computer around. Yes?
Professor Barrett, I want to check with you as the brain population. How we offer, there's a great talent pool there too. How can they, which is one of those, later on participate in this creation and bring up the competitiveness and social? Do you have any suggestions?
I'm struggling with the question.
Okay. For the green population.
The grain population.
Right.
Well, I'm grayer than you are, okay.
What are your recommendations of to the policy makers? What can you do?
Never stop learning is the best advice. I mean, we used to have a saying at Intel, which was your college education, your university education had a half-life of about 3 or 4 years. And so the minute you stop learning, you start going out of date. And I think this is, by implication, when the presidential candidates in the US or in any country are talking about the middle class and how to restore the middle class, I don't see how it can be done without infusing in the middle class a new set of skills, which means you can't stop learning, you can't stop advancing. So my advice to my kids and grandkids is don't stop learning. My advice to us would be exactly the same. You have to do something new all the time, or you're going to be out of date. And I think that's especially true. Moore's law is not slowing down, and the world's economic environment is not slowing down. So either you continually get new skills, adapt new skills to the new environment, or you fall behind. And so part of deciding that if you want to win, you have to choose to compete. Choosing to compete is learning new skills.
But how do you get people to participate? I mean, some of people, after their retirement age, they go to the beach.
Well, if you're past your retirement age and you have a suitable retirement, then I guess you get your choice of learning something or being a couch potato. But if you're still in your professional career, your working years, in my mind, you really have no choice. You either do it or you fall behind. And that is the whole issue that I was talking about. If you want to win, you have to choose to compete. And most people who want a nice salary and a nice home and a nice standard of living, the norm in the world today is if you want that, you have to choose to compete. You have no other option.
One last question.
One last question.
Okay. 50% of your talent pool here is women in the workforce, but the attrition rate for women in STEM careers is very rapid, and there's well-known research that attests to this fact. What responsibility should the US have, should the private sector have, to prevent the attrition of women in the STEM fields?
Well, I'm not sure that that there is a responsibility to prevent attrition in the female workforce. I think there's a responsibility to provide equal opportunity to women in the professional workforce. And that starts all the way in K through 12 when you unfortunately turn off a lot of young girls on math and science, and on through the university to get, I don't know what your distribution of male-female School of Engineering is today?
It's getting better.
That is the sort of answer you get in the political theater. We could ask him more specifically. Could you give us a percentage?
Yes, I can. At the undergraduate level, the School of Engineering is about 30% women, but you have to go deeper than that because some majors are 50% women, and some majors are 15% women. Yeah. And the question we need to ask, I think, is why are some of them 50% and why are some of them 15%? And especially, why is computer science one of the 15% when there are so many opportunities here in the Valley for computer science graduates? So it's a deeper question than just the single number.
I fully expect, because I know the situation at Intel, which is every major corporation faces that issue and then tries to have the right environment for equal opportunity for women, equal advancement opportunities, educational opportunities, management opportunities, or technical track opportunities, depending on what the individual wants. Mm-hmm. But it's pretty clear that is one of the key factors, as well as women tend to lag behind in their participation, but other minorities lag behind as well. So usually you'll see parallel efforts on Hispanics, African Americans, women, and if you're in a geography where you have a lot of Native Americans, they usually are kind of at the bottom end of that distribution as well. There are a lot of social economic things you have to do to include those different groups in the Equal Opportunity Clause.
So I'm really sorry we have to cut this off at this point, but Craig has a plane to catch and has to leave in about 20 minutes or something like that. But there is a reception outside. There's drinks and a little bit of food and so on. We would encourage you to stay around, meet old friends, talk to new friends, and Craig will, I'm sure, be available to chat for a few more minutes. But Craig, thank you. You're our hero. Thanks very much.